Residents of Miami will never forget that day. Horrible insect torture and other forms of abuse killed Ava Martinez, a 3-year-old girl. However, what caused this collision? Watch this space for a closer examination of this startling situation. Miami was a city of duality, where sunlight danced on the waves by day and shadows stretched long across the streets by night. It was a place where the rich flaunted their wealth in high-rising penthouses overlooking the ocean, while just a few blocks away, struggling families crowded into run-down apartments, their lives hidden behind rusted metal gates and peeling paint. Tourists saw only the glitz, the shimmering skyline, the pastel-colored Art Deco buildings, the palm trees swaying gently in the ocean breeze. They walked along Ocean Drive, laughing over cocktails, blissfully unaware of the stories that unfolded just beneath the surface, in the forgotten corners where the city's true nature lay. Miami was beautiful, but it was also cruel. It had a way of swallowing people whole, of letting their dreams dissolve into the humid air, leaving them with nothing but the weight of their own failures. For Isabelle Martinez, Miami had never been the paradise she once imagined it to be. She had arrived in the city with a suitcase full of borrowed hope, believing that this place, with its golden beaches and endless possibilities, would offer her a new beginning. She had grown up in a small town in Texas, where life had been quiet and predictable, but suffocating in its stillness. Miami, with its constant movement, its vibrancy, had seemed like the perfect escape, but dreams had a way of fading quickly in a city like this. Reality set in the moment she realized that rent was high, jobs were scarce, and the people who promised to help often vanished when she needed them most. She had been young, naive, convinced that she could carve out a life for herself, but Miami did not care for hopeful girls with no money and no connections. It took and took until there was nothing left to give. The apartment she ended up in was small, cramped, and always too hot. The air conditioner rattled uselessly, barely cooling the thick humidity that clung to everything. The walls were thin, so thin that she could hear the arguments of the couple next door, the crying of the baby 2 floors down, the constant hum of the city just outside the window. She had been there for years now, long enough to know that the neighborhood she lived in was the kind people pretended not to see. It was not the part of Miami that ended up on postcards or in travel magazines. There were no luxury cars here, no celebrities walking the streets. There were only the desperate and the struggling, people who clung to survival like it was the only thing keeping them from being swallowed whole. Despite the struggles, there had been light in Isabelle's life, her daughter, Ava. From the moment she was born, Ava had been the center of Isabelle's world, a small beacon of warmth in an existence that often felt unbearably cold. Her little girl had a laugh that filled the apartment, a bright, innocent sound that cut through the weight of Isabelle's exhaustion. She had big brown eyes that always looked at the world with wonder, as if she could see the beauty that her mother had long since stopped believing in. Ava was the only thing that made life bearable, the only reason Isabelle kept going. But love was not enough to shield a child from the dangers that lurked in the city's shadows. Miami was full of people who had lost themselves, who had given in to the hunger of the streets. Luis Rojas was one of those people. He had drifted in and out of Isabelle's life, a man with a charming smile and dark, empty eyes. He had told her all the right things at first, the kind of words that made her believe that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to do this alone anymore. He had promised security, stability, whispered about a future where things would be easier, but those promises had been nothing more than illusions, the kind that disappeared the moment she let him into her home. Luis had a darkness inside him, a cruelty that lurked beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to show itself. And when it did, Isabelle had been too afraid to fight back. No one in Miami saw the horror that was unfolding behind the closed doors of that small apartment. The city, in all its blinding brightness, had a way of hiding its darkest secrets. People walked past the building every day, never stopping to wonder what might be happening inside. The neighbors, used to the sounds of struggling families, ignored the muffled cries, the quiet suffering. In a place where survival meant minding your own business, no one looked too closely. It was easier that way. There was something uniquely cruel about a city that could offer so much beauty while allowing so much suffering to go unnoticed. The streets were alive with music, with laughter, with the constant movement of people chasing dreams that were always just out of reach. But in the quiet corners, in the places where no one bothered to look, there were stories of loss, of pain, of people who had slipped through the cracks. Ava Martinez was one of those people, a child too young to understand the darkness that had taken root in her home, too small to fight against the monsters that lurked in the shadows. In the days leading up to her death, Miami remained the same as it always had been, loud, restless, indifferent. The sun still rose over the ocean, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. Tourists still walked the beaches, their feet sinking into the warm sand, unaware of the horrors that existed just a few miles away. The city kept moving, never stopping, never noticing the small tragedies that unfolded in the apartments and alleyways that lined its streets. And when Ava's voice was silenced forever, Miami did not pause. It did not mourn. It did not care. Because in the end, that was the true nature of the city. It was a place of contrasts, of light and darkness, of life and death existing side by side. A place where dreams were born and destroyed in the same breath. And for Ava, it had been nothing more than a cruel and silent witness to her suffering. A city that had watched, indifferent, as she was swallowed by its shadows. Luis Rojas had always been the kind of man who could blend into any environment. He had the face of someone who had learned how to charm, how to manipulate, how to wear a mask so well that even those closest to him never saw what lay beneath. His dark eyes carried a quiet intensity, a gaze that could shift from warm and inviting to cold and lifeless in an instant. He was the type of man who moved through life without leaving a trace, someone who had mastered the art of disappearing just enough to avoid real scrutiny. And in a city like Miami, where transience was a way of life, he knew how to take advantage of the fact that people rarely looked too closely at the strangers around them. When he met Isabelle Martinez, she had been desperate for stability. She was tired of struggling alone, of trying to raise her daughter in a city that seemed determined to wear her down. She had seen Luis as a way out, a man who could provide the security she had long since given up on finding. He had come into her life at just the right moment, when her defenses were weak, when she was too tired to question his sudden kindness. He made promises, whispered reassurances, spoke about the future in a way that made her believe that maybe, just maybe, things could finally be different. And she had let him in, ignoring the quiet warning in the back of her mind that told her something about him was off. At first, things had been fine. Luis had a way of making himself seem harmless, of presenting himself as someone who could be trusted. He played the role of the protective boyfriend well, offering to help with bills, bringing small gifts for Ava, acting as though he truly cared about the family he had inserted himself into. But that was the trick with men like Luis. They never revealed their true selves right away. The darkness always came later, after trust had been earned, after escape had become impossible. It started with small things, little moments that Isabelle brushed off as nothing more than mood swings. Luis would go silent for hours, his expression unreadable, as though he was somewhere else entirely. Then there were the sudden flashes of temper, the way his voice could go from calm to sharp in an instant. He never hit Isabelle in those early days, never raised a hand to Ava, but the air in the apartment felt different when he was around. It was heavier, filled with an unspoken tension that made Isabelle tread carefully, as though one wrong word might set something in motion that she couldn't take back. Luis had a way of making Isabelle feel small, of making her believe that she was nothing without him. He controlled the smallest aspects of her life, deciding when she could go out, who she could talk to, what she could do. It wasn't long before she realized that she was trapped, that the man she had welcomed into her home had no intention of letting her go. He didn't need to use force to make her stay. Fear did that for him. Fear of what he might do, of what he might become if she ever tried to leave. And then there was Ava. Luis never saw the child as a person, not in the way Isabelle did. To him, Ava was an inconvenience, a reminder of Isabelle's past, a fragile, breakable thing that he could mold into whatever he wanted. He didn't see innocence when he looked at her. He saw something weaker than himself, something that could be controlled. At first, it was subtle. The way he would ignore her when she spoke, the way his expression would darken when she cried. Then came the punishments, disguised as lessons. Isabelle would come home to find Ava in the corner, her small frame shaking, tears running down her face, while Luis stood over her with an unreadable expression. "She needs discipline," he would say. "You let her do whatever she wants, and that's not how the world works." Isabelle, too afraid to argue, too afraid to push back, let it happen. The punishments escalated. Luis was methodical, calculated in the way he inflicted his cruelty. He didn't lash out in obvious ways, never leaving marks in places where someone might see them. Instead, he found quieter ways to break Ava down. He locked her in the closet for hours, leaving her in the suffocating darkness, letting her scream herself hoarse until she had no voice left. He would place her in a freezing bath, forcing her to sit in the icy water until her tiny body shook violently from the cold. He took away her food, letting her go hungry for days at a time, only to shove meals in front of her and demand that she eat everything in a matter of minutes, punishing her when she couldn't. Isabelle knew what was happening. She saw the bruises, the way Ava flinched at sudden movements, the way her once bright eyes had dimmed into something hollow. She knew, but she did nothing. She told herself she was powerless, that if she fought back, Luis would turn his rage on her instead. And maybe he would. Maybe that was true. But the real truth, the one Isabelle couldn't admit even to herself, was that she had already abandoned Ava the moment she let Luis into their lives. The neighbors heard things. Muffled cries, the occasional crash of something breaking. But in Miami, people learn not to ask questions. They learned to keep their heads down, to ignore the things that didn't directly affect them. It wasn't their business. And so, no one intervened. No one knocked on the door. No one called the police. Luis had won. He had turned their home into a prison, and Isabelle into a silent accomplice. Ava had no escape, no protection, no way to fight back. She was 3 years old, too small to understand why the man in her home hurt her. Too young to know that this wasn't normal, that the world outside their apartment was not like this. And that was the greatest tragedy of all. That by the time the end came, Ava had already stopped believing that there was anything beyond the suffering. Luis never considered himself a monster. He believed in control, in power, in bending people to his will. To him, what he did wasn't cruelty, it was order, it was discipline. Ava was nothing more than an extension of his control, a thing to be molded, to be broken, and as his grip on their lives tightened, as his punishments became more severe, it became clear that there was no line he wouldn't cross. The worst was still to come. The darkness that Luis carried inside him had not yet fully revealed itself. But it would. And when it did, it would leave behind something irreparable. A wound that no amount of time could ever heal. The hidden monster had been lurking in the shadows for too long. Now, it was ready to step into the light. At first, it wasn't obvious. The changes in Ava were small, subtle things that could be brushed aside as childhood phases. She became quieter, less eager to play. Her bright, curious energy slowly replaced by something subdued, something hesitant. She stopped reaching for her mother, no longer running into Isabelle's arms the way she used to. She flinched at unexpected noises, at the sound of footsteps approaching, at the creak of the front door. Luis had begun his work carefully, knowing that to break something completely, you had to weaken it first. Ava, in her smallness, in her innocence, was an easy target. The punishment started as what Luis called corrections, small infractions. Crying too loudly, knocking over a toy, refusing food, were met with stern words at first, but that was never enough for him. Control, real control, required fear. He would grab her by the wrist, squeezing just hard enough to make her whimper, just enough to make her understand that disobedience would not be tolerated. When that wasn't enough, he would push her into a corner, forcing her to stand for hours until her tiny legs trembled. If she moved, if she tried to sit, he would yank her back up, his voice cold and sharp, reminding her that she was nothing, that her pain meant nothing. The longer she stood, the more she learned not to fight back. Luis was patient in his cruelty, He knew that breaking someone completely wasn't about a single act of violence. It was about erosion, about stripping them down piece by piece until there was nothing left. He would withhold food, not enough to starve her outright, but just enough to keep her weak. Some nights, she would be given a plate of food only to have it snatched away before she could take a bite. Other times, she would be forced to eat everything in front of her, even when she was full, even when she sobbed between mouthfuls, her small body struggling to keep up with the relentless demand. The isolation was worse. Ava was locked away for hours at a time, placed in a dark closet with nothing but the sound of her own breathing. At first, she cried, pounding her tiny fists against the door, her voice breaking with sobs. But after a while, the crying stopped. It always stopped. Louise knew that fear had a way of settling deep in the bones, that the longer she was left in the dark, the more it would become a part of her. She would learn to be silent. She would learn to be still. And when he finally let her out, she would look up at him with those wide, tear-streaked eyes, her lips trembling, waiting for permission to exist again. Louise thrived on those moments, the power, the absolute control over something so small, so fragile, it made him feel invincible. He would watch as Ava curled in on herself, her arms wrapped tightly around her tiny body, as if trying to make herself disappear. He knew she was too young to understand what was happening, too young to put words to the terror she felt, but that didn't matter. Fear was a language all on its own, and she was learning to speak it fluently. As the days passed, the punishments became more creative. Louise took pleasure in finding new ways to break her down. He made her hold her hands out, palms facing up, and placed heavy books on them, forcing her to stay still or risk them tumbling onto the floor. If she dropped them, she had to start again. He made her kneel on uncooked rice, the sharp grains biting into her soft skin, leaving imprints that lingered long after she was allowed to stand. Sometimes he would place her hands in ice-cold water, watching as she shivered, her fingers turning red and numb. It fascinated him to see how long she could endure before she collapsed, before her small body gave out under the weight of suffering. But the worst was the insects. Louise had always been fascinated by them. The way they crawled, the way they swarmed, the way they could consume something completely if given enough time. At first, he used them as a scare tactic. He would hold a cockroach in front of Ava's face, watching as she recoiled in horror, her small body pressing against the nearest wall as if she could somehow melt into it. Then he escalated. He would place them on her skin, let them crawl over her arms, her legs, her face. He would laugh when she screamed, when she tried to shake them off, when she begged for them to stop. But it never stopped. The ants were worse. Louise found a colony outside, collecting them in a jar, shaking it just enough to agitate them before spilling them onto Ava's bare skin. They bit and stung, tiny red welts blooming across her fragile body as she convulsed in pain. But Louise didn't stop there. He tied her wrists together, making it impossible for her to swat them away, forcing her to endure the torment until he decided she had suffered enough. The fire ants left her body raw, the pain radiating long after they had been removed. But it was never enough. It would never be enough. Isabelle saw the marks, saw the welts, the bruises, the hollowed-out expression in her daughter's eyes. She knew what was happening. She knew, and yet she did nothing. Fear had taken root inside her, wrapping around her like chains, keeping her silent, keeping her obedient. She told herself she had no choice. She told herself she was just as trapped as Ava was. But the truth was worse. The truth was that she had already abandoned her daughter long before Louise had laid his hands on her. She had let the monster in, and now there was no way out. Ava stopped fighting. That was how Isabelle knew that the torture had truly worked. There was no more resistance, no more desperate attempts to escape, no more screams loud enough to wake the neighbors. When Louise locked her in the closet, she no longer pounded on the door. When he placed insects on her skin, she no longer struggled. When he denied her food, she no longer asked for it. She had become something else, something broken, something unrecognizable from the child she had once been. Louise had won, and he knew it. He carried himself differently now, with the smug confidence of a man who had complete and utter control. Ava was nothing more than a toy to him, something to be played with, to be used and discarded. The small victories, watching her flinch at his touch, watching her obey his every command without question, fueled him. But he wasn't finished. The real fun had yet to begin, because he knew there was still one thing left to take: hope, and soon he would take that too. There was a moment when Ava stopped crying. It wasn't because the pain had lessened or because she had grown accustomed to the horrors inflicted upon her. It was because she had learned that it didn't matter. Her tears changed nothing. The screams she once let out, the desperate pleading wails, had been met only with laughter, or worse, punishment for making noise. So, she stopped. Silence became her only defense, though it was no defense at all. Luis had stripped her of everything: her sense of safety, her ability to seek comfort, her understanding that the world could be anything other than a place of suffering. But now he wanted more. Breaking her spirit had not been enough. He wanted to see how far he could push, how much further the boundaries of cruelty could stretch before her small, fragile body could take no more. Pain was no longer just a lesson, it was a spectacle. Luis had moved past simple control. Now, his torment was something calculated, something artistic in its savagery. He took his time, crafting new ways to make Ava suffer, taking pleasure in the slow unraveling of her small form. He started with fire. A cigarette pressed against the softest parts of her skin, the underside of her arms, the backs of her legs. The burn would begin as nothing more than a sharp sting, but then it would grow, blooming into unbearable agony. Her small body would jerk in response, but she didn't scream. Not anymore. The absence of her cries was almost disappointing to Luis, though he took it as proof that he had reshaped her into something even more pathetic than before. He needed something new, something worse. The insects had been entertaining, but he wanted to escalate. He had already covered her in cockroaches, watched as they crawled over her face, their legs skittering across her cheeks, slipping into her mouth when she gasped in horror. He had placed biting ants on her skin, tied her hands behind her back to stop her from brushing them away. But he wasn't finished. He wanted something that wouldn't just make her squirm, but would leave her in agony for days. So he brought out the centipedes. They were long, segmented creatures, their bodies winding and writhing, their legs moving in quick, frantic bursts. He dropped them onto Ava's exposed stomach, watching as they slithered over her ribs, their sharp pincers biting into her soft flesh. The venom left swollen welts in their wake, red and inflamed, a burning pain that would not fade quickly. She twitched beneath their movement, her body convulsing as the poison spread. But she didn't scream. Her lips parted, a shallow, gasping breath escaping. But there were no tears left to shed. She had already given them all away. Luis found new ways to test the limits of her endurance. He began to experiment with temperature. One night, he filled the bathtub with ice water and forced her inside, holding her there as her skin turned pale, her limbs trembling from the unbearable cold. The tiny gasps of breath, the way her lips turned blue, fascinated him. He left her there for hours, watching as her shivers grew weaker, as her body slumped against the porcelain, unable to resist anymore. Then, when he finally pulled her out, he burned her again, pressing the heated metal of a spoon against her frostbitten skin, the sudden contrast of pain making her body convulse violently. She had long since stopped struggling. That was what made it fun. She took every blow, every wound, every new horror he inflicted upon her, and still she breathed. Still she endured. And it enraged him. He wanted her to fight back, to react, to give him something more than her silent acceptance of pain. But she had nothing left to give. Her eyes, once wide with fear, had dulled into something vacant. She had been drained of everything that made her a person. And Luis, in his twisted mind, saw that as a challenge. There was one more thing he had yet to take from her: her ability to move, to function, to survive on her own at all. He wanted to make sure she would never escape, never even think about running. He turned to physical destruction. He took his time with her hands, her feet, making sure that each finger, each toe, bore the marks of his control. He twisted them, bent them, applied pressure until he heard the faintest crack. The pain must have been unbearable, but Ava made no sound. Her body jerked in response, but she remained silent, accepting. That silence only made him angrier. She was so small, so fragile, but somehow still alive. He needed to end that. Not just her body, but the last flickering ember of life inside her. He could see it deep in her hollow eyes, a remnant of something that refused to die, something that would not surrender, no matter how much pain he inflicted. He could not allow that to exist. He needed to stamp it out, to erase it completely. He began starving her, not the way he had before, with missed meals or small portions. This was complete deprivation. For days, she was left with nothing but water, her tiny stomach collapsing in on itself, her ribs pushing through her skin. Her body was breaking down, consuming itself, struggling to find energy where none existed. The last days of her life were spent in that state. Frail, motionless, unable to lift her own arms, unable to hold herself upright. When he looked at her now, there was no longer a person staring back. Just a husk, a shell of something that had once been alive, but was now only waiting for death. And he relished in it. He had done this. He had taken something pure, something filled with light, and turned it into nothing. And he had stripped her of everything, her childhood, her body, her will to live. The moment death came for her, it was not dramatic. There was no final plea for help, no last desperate attempt to cling to life. She simply slipped away, her tiny body too weak to fight anymore, her mind too exhausted to resist. She had been dead long before her final breath. He had made sure of that. She had said, "Hush, Pop," or "Pick up," and when it was over, when she lay lifeless on the cold floor of that darkened apartment, Luis felt nothing. No guilt, no remorse, only satisfaction. He had won. He had proven his dominance over something weaker than himself, and in his mind, that was all that ever mattered. In the final hours of Ava Martinez's short, tortured life, there was no relief, no moment of kindness, no last glimmer of comfort. Her body had already begun shutting down, her once round cherubic face now gaunt and hollow, her limbs thin and weak, her skin covered in bruises, welts, and burns that told the story of every atrocity committed against her. The child who had once filled the apartment with soft giggles now lay motionless in the dimly lit room, barely clinging to life. Her breaths were shallow, her chest rising and falling in weak, uneven patterns, each exhale a whisper of a body too broken to continue. Luis Rojas, the man who had orchestrated her suffering, watched without emotion. She had become a living corpse, her existence reduced to mere survival, a body too weak to even shiver despite the cold that surrounded her. The bruises on her skin had deepened into sickening shades of purple and yellow, her fingers curled inward as if her muscles no longer had the strength to stretch them out. The burns that had once made her scream in agony were now nothing more than marks on a body too exhausted to react. Her stomach, which had once rounded with the fullness of childhood, was now concave, her ribs visible beneath her pale, stretched skin. Hunger had consumed her, stripped away any remaining energy, leaving only the fragile shell of a child whose suffering had long since surpassed anything that could be called humane. She no longer fought back. She no longer flinched when he touched her. She had been reduced to silence, to submission, to something unrecognizable from the child she had once been. Even her eyes, those wide, brown eyes that had once held so much innocence, were now vacant, staring at nothing, her gaze unfocused as if she had already begun to drift beyond the walls that had imprisoned her for so long. Whatever small flicker of resistance had once existed inside her had finally been extinguished. She was still alive, but in the way a flickering candle is alive just before the last ember burns out. Louise wanted to see how much further she could go, how much more she could take. He had already stretched the limits of her endurance, pushing her further and further. And now, as she lay there, unmoving, her body shutting down on its own. He realized he had nearly reached the end. He had done this before, left her alone for hours, locked in the darkness, forced to endure hunger, pain, cold. But this time was different. She had nothing left. Even her breath, weak as it was, seemed like it could stop at any moment. He knew it would be soon, and in a way he was disappointed. He had wanted more from her, had wanted to see just how much a small, helpless child could endure before finally breaking. But she was already broken. Now, she was just waiting for death. He denied her water, knowing it would only prolong what was inevitable. He left her curled on the floor, her body too weak to shift positions, her tiny fingers twitching involuntarily as her muscles spasmed from starvation and dehydration. Her lips were cracked, her skin dull, her breathing slower with each passing hour. If she felt pain, she didn't show it anymore. There was no reaction, no whimper, no protest. Just the steady decline of a body that had been pushed past its limits. Her heart, barely able to sustain itself, slowed to a weak rhythm, her pulse faint and irregular. Her body had no more fight left. The room smelled of sickness, of decay. Her body had stopped processing food days ago, and the lack of water had drained the last bit of life from her veins. Her hair, once soft and full, was now brittle, clumped together from weeks of neglect, strands falling out in small patches. The child that had once run barefoot across the tiled floor, chasing imaginary adventures, was now just a lifeless thing on the ground, waiting for death to take her. The hours passed slowly, each moment dragging toward the inevitable. Luis barely paid attention, letting her die in silence, watching only when he felt like it, fascinated by how fragile she had become. He had enjoyed every moment of her suffering, but now that it was coming to an end, he felt nothing. No remorse, no regret, only the cold satisfaction of knowing that he had taken everything from her. As the final hour approached, Ava's breathing became more erratic. Her chest barely moved now, her pulse faint, as if her body was hesitant to take those last few steps into the void. She did not move, did not cry, did not make a sound. Her body had already surrendered. It was only a matter of time before her heart followed. And when it did, there was nothing dramatic about it. No gasping breath, no final plea for help. Just the quiet stillness of a child too broken to hold on any longer. When it was over, Luis didn't react. He stepped over her, his expression indifferent, as if all he had done was turn off a light. Ava was gone, her suffering ended not by mercy, not by kindness, but by the sheer exhaustion of a body that had endured more than it was ever meant to. The apartment was silent. The same walls that had contained her screams now held nothing but emptiness. The city of Miami continued on, unaware that a small, innocent life had been erased from existence. The streets were still alive with movement, the world still bathed in the warm glow of the sun. People laughed, cars honked, music played from open windows. No one knew, no one saw. The city remained indifferent, swallowing her story just as it had swallowed so many others. And in that dark apartment, the only evidence of her suffering was the small, lifeless body left behind. The discovery of Ava Martinez's body did not come swiftly. In the humid, indifferent sprawl of Miami, tragedies often went unnoticed for too long, and this one was no different. The walls of the apartment had absorbed her suffering in silence, shielding the truth from the world outside. Days passed after her final breath before anyone thought to question where she had gone. The air inside the small, suffocating space had already begun to change, taking on the unmistakable weight of decay. But in a city where people had learned to ignore what didn't concern them, it took time before the scent of death forced itself into the outside world. It was the neighbors who first noticed something was wrong. The crying had stopped. That alone should have been a relief. But the silence was unnatural, heavy in a way that sent an unspoken message. For weeks, they had become accustomed to the muffled sounds of distress, the occasional thud of something heavy hitting the floor, the strange, unsettling energy that seemed to emanate from behind the apartment door. They had heard the child before, had known that whatever life existed inside that home was one of misery. And yet, no one had stepped in. No one had asked questions. But now, there was nothing. No movement, no sound. Only stillness. The building's landlord was the first to act. Complaints had begun to circulate about the smell, a thick, putrid scent that seeped through the thin walls and crept under doorways. At first, it was dismissed. Miami's heat had a way of making everything rot faster. Garbage, food, forgotten things left in the sun too long. But this was different. This was something no one could ignore. The landlord, irritated by the mounting concerns, knocked on the door. There was no answer. He knocked again, harder this time, calling out for Luis. But the apartment remained silent. Something was wrong. It took several more hours before the police arrived. By then, the air was suffocating, the entire hallway thick with the unmistakable stench of death. Officers forced their way inside, the door groaning on its hinges as it swung open, revealing the horrors that had been hidden for far too long. The heat trapped inside the apartment only intensified the smell, making some of the officers gag as they stepped inside. The room was dark, the curtains drawn, the space eerily still. The first thing they noticed was the disorder. The broken furniture, the stains on the floor, the remnants of a life lived in chaos. And then they saw her. Ava's body lay in the far corner of the room, curled into itself, as if even in death she had tried to make herself as small as possible. Her skin, pale and stretched over delicate bones, bore the marks of everything she had endured: bruises, burns, welts that traced the history of her suffering like a roadmap. Her limbs were stiff, her tiny fingers curled inward, frozen in the final moments of her agony. The officers who found her had seen death before, had encountered violence in its many forms, but this was different. This was something darker, something that settled into their bones and made them question how such cruelty could exist. It did not take long to piece together what had happened. The apartment itself was a crime scene, every inch of it tainted with evidence of Ava's suffering. The closet where she had been locked away for hours, the bathtub where she had been left shivering in ice-cold water, the floor where she had spent her final moments. It was all there, laid bare in the filth and neglect, in the way the air itself seemed to hold on to the echoes of her pain. Luis Rojas was nowhere to be found. He had vanished, slipping away before the discovery could be made, leaving behind only the wreckage of his cruelty. The search for him began immediately. His face plastered across news stations, his name spoken with the kind of venom reserved for the worst of monsters. But in a city as vast as Miami, disappearing was easy. There were places to hide, people willing to shelter those who didn't deserve it. The news of Ava's murder spread quickly. The city that had ignored her suffering now cried out in outrage, demanding justice for the child they had failed to protect. Strangers left flowers outside the apartment building, candles flickering on the sidewalk where she had once walked, her small feet padding against the pavement. Reporters swarmed the area, their cameras capturing the makeshift memorials, the grief-stricken faces of those who mourned a child they had never known. But the sorrow came too late. The outrage came too late. Ava was already gone. Luis was found days later, hiding in a rundown motel on the outskirts of the city, his face gaunt, his eyes hollow. He had run, but he had not escaped. The police took him into custody without struggle, his silence unbroken as they placed him in handcuffs, as they led him to the patrol car. There was no remorse in his expression, no regret, no acknowledgement of the horror he had inflicted. He was a man who had spent so long taking pleasure in suffering that he no longer recognized the weight of what he had done. His trial became a spectacle. The courtroom was packed with people who had never met Ava but carried her name on their lips, demanding justice for the life that had been stolen. The prosecution laid out the evidence, the brutal details of her final days, the injuries that told the story of her suffering more clearly than words ever could. The defense tried to paint him as mentally unstable, as a man whose past had shaped him into what he had become. But no one believed it. There was no excuse for what he had done. no justification for the level of cruelty he had inflicted on a child, too young to understand why she had been made to suffer. The jury did not deliberate long. The verdict was swift: guilty on all counts: first-degree murder, aggravated child abuse, torture. The sentencing followed soon after, the weight of his crimes ensuring that he would never see freedom again. But for many, it was not enough. No punishment could undo what had been done. No prison cell could erase the fact that Ava had suffered alone, that she had died waiting for a mercy that never came. In the aftermath, the apartment was emptied, the space stripped of the horrors it had contained, but the memory of what had happened there lingered, a ghost that would not be silenced. The city moved on, as cities always do, but the story of Ava Martinez remained. Her name became a symbol, a reminder of the price of indifference, of the consequences of looking away. Laws were proposed in her name, meant to prevent another child from enduring the same fate. But for those who had known her, who had loved her, it was all too little, too late. In the end, justice was a hollow thing. Luis was behind bars, his life reduced to a cold, gray existence. But Ava was still gone, and no amount of reckoning could bring her back.